the head of the serpent, if you like, in West Asia is Israel, the creation of the Rothschilds and the British, and supported and maintained by America with $4 billion a year just on the surface, and of course maintained by the Rothschilds corporate network, which supplies money on the quiet to maintain artificially the state of Israel. Para que se asustan será pa' mejor. Es el pueblo entero el que ya está gritando. Viva la revolución.
Iranian nuclear weapons development.
They have turned the island into a communist hellhole.
The experiment in Venezuela has failed completely.
In 1917, Walter Rothschild, the second Baron Rothschild, was the addressee of the Balfour Declaration to the Zionist Federation, which committed the British government to the establishment in Palestine of a, quote, national home for the Jewish people, the settler state of Israel. And basically after the death of Jacob de Rothschild in 1868, his eldest son, Alphonse Rothschild, took over the management of the family bank and supported Bankrolled the creation of the state of Israel by the billions. The Rothschild family was one of the biggest proponents of Zionism with Theodore Herzl and the World Zionist Congress. And James A. de Rothschild financed the Knesset building as a gift to the state of Israel. The Knesset building is like their version of the parliament. And the Supreme Court of Israel as well was donated to Israel by Dorothy de Rothschild. So their connections go far and deep. Mohsin, your reaction and analysis to all of this?
Yes, I think the Israel issue and the connection with the Rothschilds is a very important one. I didn't really touch on their links to slavery, and I'll skip that for now because you kind of touched on it with when you talked about the King Leopold of Belgium. And King Leopold of Belgium committed the largest genocide in world history. And it goes under the radar. I mean, the number of millions, tens of millions that he killed in the Congo is something that's been brushed under the ground. But behind all this was the money of the Rothschild network yet again. So they had really do have blood on their hands. Later, when the slaves were supposedly liberated or given or emancipated, they actually apparently paid for the slave traders who lost money when they actually had to give up their slaves. They evidently get paid. And the reality was that what it was a debt which was imposed on the British government, which was only cleared literally about 5 or 6 years ago. So the Rothschilds managed to create a debt. They didn't do that for free. What they did was they put that all on the taxpayers' bill. Essentially, they didn't do anything towards cleaning up slavery, which was their mess primarily. And they, in fact, were still taking money back even until 2015. This is how the Rothschilds and these folk operate. They basically they won't give you a dime without something. A price being paid. You moved on to Israel, which is the other major travesty in my mind, which still lives on very much so. And I'll pick on Edmund de Rothschild, who from 1845 to 1934, he was the youngest son of James and Betty de Rothschild, but he basically was very involved in the work in Palestine, doing the groundwork that led to such a smooth entry of what I would call fake Jewry, really, that was imported from Europe into the land of Palestine later. But his work as a strong supporter of Zionism, his achievements were basically that he created this bridge for the establishment of the state of Israel, and his essential philanthropy basically funded Jewish settlements. And it encouraged the development of agriculture and in industry. He was a benefactor of Jewish colonists, essentially. Backdoor colonists, and they did it with the people who were very welcoming, because they didn't understand what the agenda was that was going on. Of course, the agenda was revealed with the Balfour Declaration and the manipulation of the British, government to essentially hand over Palestine to people who had no connection to it, essentially. Of course, what they did was, they essentially supported these Jewish colonists, overseeing, first of all, dozens of new colonies. They called it Rishon LeZion, the first in Zion. That's what they actually termed it. And it was followed by others bearing the names of Edmund's parents. And Edmund stimulated the economic development of these settlements by investing in new crops. And it was wine, and it was kind of grapefruits and avocado, and industrial enterprises like silk production. He played basically a key role in the entire development of Israel's wine industry and other industries long before Israel was even created. He was building those kind of means for sustaining those who were going there. And he did this also, interestingly, under the supervision of the administrators in Ottoman Palestine, which tells you how much power the Rothschilds had even in the Muslim world. And you mentioned Ayatollah Khomeini, who, of course, has principles which say no usury. Ultimately, they come down to that. And that no usury has translated into a deep suspicion of the Bank of International Settlements, into the suspicion against, the World Bank, against even the World Trade Organization. These are all levers of power of the Rothschilds and their elitist network. These are political levers of power, economic levers of power, which now do the dirty work. The IMF basically, goes in, lends money, then squeezes poor countries into basically further debt and destruction. And if they don't comply, the US military, which is another wing of the Rothschilds, boots on the ground, essentially. If we cut to the chase, those military boot boys go in to punish anybody who's not complying to the diktats of the Rothschilds, economic corporation networks. And of course, this went on there in Israel, and it was very easy for them there because the Turks were essentially already under Zionist control as well, to be fair. And the Arabs were basically not really of any substance. They didn't even have any power. They were again manipulated and used to create this kind of fragmented Middle East, which was again a Rothschild stroke Rockefeller initiative, because they knew they needed the oil for the next 100 years, the carbon, if you like, energy supplies were all going to come from there. Now, they had decided this all in the 19th century. And so the 20th century, they were prepared and they were building towards this. Israel was partly created by the Rothschilds to act as a policeman to watch over the Saudis and all their other stooges that they set up, the Arab stooges, the Zio Arabs, who were going to be giving them their oil. But they didn't quite trust them fully because they were a bit basic. And so what they did was they created Israel partly for the purpose of being a monitor, a proxy, a kind of policeman that would impose the threat of, physical invasion or terror on the Zio Saudis or the Zio Kuwaitis or the Zio Bahrainis, those who had oil. That period is now coming to an end. Of course, oil is gradually running out. So, but Israel's still there, and Israel is opposed again by that man Khomeini's vision, because he recognized that the head of the serpent, if you like, in West Asia is Israel, the creation of the Rothschilds and the British, and supported and maintained by America with $4 billion a year just on the surface, and of course maintained by the Rothschilds corporate network, which supplies money on the quiet to maintain artificially the state of Israel. So you see that from before its inception, there was an entire build-up process where, these settlements were being built in Palestine under the branch of the Jewish Colonization Association, and they then transformed into a formal state, and even the United Nations, another Rothschilds creation essentially rubber stamped it in 1949 after initially pretending they were rejecting it. And then ever since, what we've seen is this failure of the United Nations to take any action or do anything for the benefit of the Palestinian people. And it's been now left to that anti-usury, anti-exploitation, anti-oppression movement of the resistance in West Asia, led by the Islamic Republic of Iran, supported now by the Yemeni resistance of the Ansarullah, supported by Hezbollah in Lebanon, supported by the Syrian army itself as well, and in Iraq by the Hashd-e-Shahabi. These are just some of the allies who've woken up to the fact that this network exists, and it is what is the main enemy. And its main physical manifestation is Israel in West Asia. Of course, the United States is totally in its grip, 30 trillion in debt. And who's that American debt owed to? It's owed to the Rothschilds, money mafia network, essentially. That's who they owe their debt to. That's who prints the free money they get from the Fed every time they need to get out of a little bit of a mess. And they're the ones who call the shots in terms of what happens on global trade. And even the modern day wars now that we see between Russia and what's going on today, I would say that what nobody really discusses is what is the role of the oligarchs in Russia in all this? What is the role of the kleptocracy in around the West? And what is the role of these Rothschilds and these outfits in all of the things that are going on over the last 2-3 years? Everything from the war on terror, supposedly, to the economic collapses, to the virus, the release of weird viruses, to the Ukraine nonsensical war in Ukraine, and of course I've not to mention the multiple wars on Muslim nations across the Middle East or Venezuela. I mean, there is an architect behind this, and there is a benefactor. It's not necessarily America that's the benefactor, which is the go-to culprit. I believe the benefactor is the Rothschilds money mafia network, and ultimately all of these things can be traced. The money trails can be traced back to the networks that create this, and you can also quite easily see who benefits every time they create one of these situations: a conflict, a war, a virus. The billionaires and the trillionaires have become the billionaires are becoming trillionaires as a result of this, and those trillionaires belong to the network that the dear old Rothschilds have very diligently created to make sure that the lives of the world are as miserable as possible.